The space station, called Harmony's Edge, floated in the void between star systems, like a metal flower made of glass and steel. Ships from 12 different worlds docked at its arms, and humans could see the lights of alien vessels through the thick windows. The station was neutral ground where no species could attack another without breaking ancient laws that kept the galaxy from burning in endless war. Lihana walked down the long corridor that led to the main meeting hall, and her small shoes made soft sounds on the metal floor. She carried a simple black tablet in her hands and wore the plain gray uniform of a diplomatic aide. Next to her walked Kim Taeho, who was the human ambassador, and he looked nervous as he adjusted his formal blue jacket. Behind them came Park Do-yoon, who was their security chief, and his hand never moved far from the weapon at his side. The meeting hall was huge, with a round table in the center that could seat 50 beings. 12 species had sent their best representatives to this emergency summit, and each delegation sat in a section designed for their specific needs. The air smelled of different atmospheres mixing together, and Hana could hear the soft hum of life support systems working to keep everyone alive. In the same room, Ambassador Kim took his seat at the human section, which was the smallest area at the table. Hana sat behind him in a simple chair with her tablet ready, and Park stood against the wall with the other security officers. Around the table sat beings that could crush humans without effort, or destroy planets with their technology, or read minds with a single thought. The Corvani delegation filled one entire section with their massive reptilian bodies. General Thex Moore was their leader, and he stood 8 feet tall with scales that looked like black armor and claws that could tear through steel. His yellow eyes moved around the room like a predator looking for prey, and when he spoke, his voice sounded like rocks grinding together. The other Corvani warriors behind him were just as large and just as dangerous. The Nexari sat in crystalline chairs that matched their translucent bodies, and their faces changed colors as they communicated with each other through thoughts instead of words. Elder Vex Nil was their speaker, and her crystal form pulsed with soft blue light when she was calm and red light when she was angry. The Nexari could read surface thoughts from most species, and their telepathic abilities made them excellent at coordination and terrible enemies to have. The Eldrani floated above their section in forms made of pure energy that shifted between different shapes and colors. Ancient Beyond Name was their representative, and he had existed for 10,000 years before humans ever left their home planet. The Eldrani could manipulate matter with their thoughts, and their wisdom was supposed to be greater than all other species combined. Other delegations filled the remaining spaces, and each one represented a civilization that could destroy humanity without breaking a sweat. The Vorthak had conquered 12 systems in the past century. The Zephyrians controlled trade routes that connected half the galaxy. The Hegemony possessed weapons that could crack moons in half. Hana sat quietly in her small chair and watched everything while her fingers moved across her tablet screen. Most beings in the room forgot she was there because humans were the newest species to join the Galactic Council, and everyone knew they were the weakest. Her tablet looked like she was taking simple notes about who spoke and what they said, but her fingers moved much faster than normal note-taking required. General Thex Moore stood up first, and his massive form cast shadows across the table. His voice boomed through the hall as he spoke about the growing threat of the Vorthon Empire. The Vorthons had appeared from the Outer Rim 3 years ago, with ships and weapons that no one had seen before. They conquered systems by destroying everything that resisted and enslaving everything that surrendered. The Corvani believed in honor through combat, and General Thex Moore demanded that all Council forces attack the Vorthons immediately. He slammed his clawed fist on the table, and the sound echoed through the hall like thunder. His warriors behind him roared their agreement, and their voices shook the walls. Elder Vex Nil pulsed red with disagreement, and her crystalline voice cut through the Corvani roars. The Nexari wanted to coordinate their telepathic abilities to confuse Vorthon commanders and make their fleets attack each other. She explained that violence without strategy was the path to destruction, and that wisdom should guide their actions. Ancient Beyond Name shifted into the form of an old tree, and his energy voice whispered like wind through leaves. The Eldrani had seen many civilizations rise and fall over the millennia, and he believed patience was the greatest weapon. He suggested that the council should observe the Vorthons longer and learn their weaknesses before acting. The debate continued, for hours as each species argued for their traditional approach to warfare. The Vorthak wanted to use their siege weapons to destroy Vorthon supply lines. The Zephyrians suggested economic warfare through trade blockades. The Hegemony proposed using their planet crackers to destroy Vorthon colonies as examples to others. Ambassador Kim tried several times to speak, but his quiet voice was lost under the roars and arguments of beings much larger and more powerful than humans. When he finally managed to get attention, he offered humanity's analytical support and suggested that humans could study Vorthon tactics and provide strategic advice to the other species. The reaction was immediate and humiliating. General Thex Moore laughed so hard that his scales rattled like armor in an earthquake. Elder Vex Neal pulsed bright yellow, which was the Nexari color, for amusement. Ancient beyond name shifted into the shape of a flower, which meant he found something delightfully naive. General Thex Moore spoke for all of them when he said that humans should leave war to warriors and stick to whatever it was that weak species did to survive. The other delegations joined in the laughter, and some made comments about humans being useful as messengers or clerks, but nothing more important than that. Ambassador Kim's face turned red with embarrassment, and Park's hand moved closer to his weapon, but Hana never looked up from her tablet. Her fingers continued to dance across the screen at impossible speed, while her eyes tracked every movement and expression in the room. She watched General Thexmore's scales shift color when he was angry. She noticed how Elder Vex Neal's light patterns changed when she disagreed with other Nexari. She observed the way Ancient Beyond Name's energy form flickered when he was thinking deeply. The summit continued into the night, with each species becoming more convinced that their way of fighting was the only correct approach. The Corvani wanted to charge directly at the enemy. The Nexari wanted to use telepathic coordination. The Eldrani wanted to wait and observe. None of them wanted to work with the others, and none of them cared what humans thought about anything. The session finally ended and delegates began to leave for their quarters. Hana closed her tablet and stood up slowly. Ambassador Kim looked defeated and Park looked angry, but Hana's expression was calm and focused. She had spent 12 hours watching and listening and learning everything she could about the beings who would decide the fate of the galaxy. General Thex Moore walked past their section and looked down at the humans with contempt. He told Ambassador Kim that humans would be safer if they stayed in their home system until real warriors dealt with real threats. Ambassador Kim tried to respond, but the general was already walking away with his massive warriors following behind him. Hana watched them go and made one final note on her tablet before following Ambassador Kim and Park back to their quarters. The station was quiet now, and the lights were dimmed for the night cycle, but Hana's mind was working faster than ever. She had gathered more information in one day than most analysts could process in a month, and she was already beginning to see patterns that no one else noticed. The greatest danger in the room tonight had not been General Thex Moore with his claws, and scales and warrior pride. It had not been Elder Vex Neal with her telepathic powers and crystalline body. It had not been Ancient Beyond Name with his 10,000 years of wisdom and energy manipulation abilities. The greatest danger had been the quiet human woman in the corner who understood them all better than they understood themselves. The human quarters on Harmony's Edge were small and simple compared to the grand chambers assigned to other species, but they were comfortable enough for the 3 humans who called them home during the summit. Ambassador Kim sat heavily in his chair and rubbed his tired eyes while Park paced back and forth like a caged animal. Hana placed her tablet on the small table and began connecting it to additional processors that she had brought in her personal luggage. Kim looked at the devices that Hana was setting up and frowned because he did not recognize half of the equipment she was using. The diplomatic aide was supposed to be there for simple tasks like taking notes and organizing schedules, but the machinery she carried looked more like military analysis gear than office supplies. Park stopped pacing and watched as Hana's fingers flew across multiple screens that showed complex data streams and mathematical formulas. Kim asked Hana about her background because he realized that he knew very little about the woman who had been assigned to his delegation just 3 weeks before the summit. Her personnel file was surprisingly thin for someone in the diplomatic corps, and most of her education records were classified above his security level. Hana continued working on her equipment while she explained her history in the same calm voice she used for everything else. She had been born on New Sol Colony 28 years ago to parents who were both university professors. By age 7, she was reading at a college level, and by age 10, she had already mastered 3 alien languages that most humans found impossible to learn. Her parents sent her to the Advanced Studies Institute on Earth, where she completed her first doctorate in xenopsychology before her 18th birthday. The xenopsychology degree had focused on how different alien species thought and behaved compared to humans and each other. Hana had studied every known alien civilization and learned to predict their actions based on cultural patterns and biological imperatives. Her doctoral thesis was titled Predictive Behavioral Modeling in Non-Human Sapient Species, and it was immediately classified by the military upon completion. She had earned her second doctorate in military strategy by age 21, while working as a consultant for the Strategic Defense Council. This degree focused on how wars were won and lost throughout galactic history, and she had analyzed every major conflict between alien species over the past 1,000 years. Her specialty was finding patterns that others missed and predicting how enemies would behave under different circumstances. Her third doctorate came at age 24, and it was in behavioral economics, which studied how beings made decisions about resources and trade and survival. This field combined psychology with mathematics to create models that could predict what choices individuals and entire species would make when faced with specific situations. Hana had used this knowledge to accurately forecast the outcomes of 17 different diplomatic negotiations. Park asked why someone with her qualifications was working as a diplomatic aide instead of running her own research facility or commanding military operations. Hana explained that she had volunteered for the diplomatic corps specifically because she wanted to observe alien species in person rather than just studying them through reports and recordings. She found alien psychology fascinating because it was so much more predictable than human behavior. Kim was confused by this statement because most humans found alien thinking completely incomprehensible. Hana's screens displayed complex charts, showing probability curves and behavioral patterns as she explained her perspective. Humans were chaotic and unpredictable because they were the only species that regularly acted against their own biological imperatives and cultural programming. Other species were much more consistent in their responses to specific stimuli. The Corvani always chose honor over survival when given the choice between dying gloriously and living with shame. The Nexari always tried to find telepathic solutions to problems, even when direct action would be more effective. The Eldrani always sought to observe and analyze rather than act quickly, even when immediate action was necessary. These patterns made them predictable to someone who understood their underlying motivations. Hana's fingers moved across her screens as she pulled up detailed psychological profiles that she had been building during the summit. Each alien delegate had a complete analysis that included their personal history, cultural background, biological limitations, and likely responses to different types of pressure. She had been gathering this information while pretending to take simple notes, and now she had enough data to predict how each being would behave in almost any situation. General Thex Moore's profile showed that he valued personal honor above tactical advantage, and would always choose the most aggressive option available, even if it was strategically foolish. His greatest fear was being seen as weak by other Corvani, and his greatest desire was to die in glorious combat against worthy enemies. He could be manipulated by questioning his courage or by presenting him with opportunities for heroic sacrifice. Elder Vex Nil's profile revealed that she sought harmony and coordination above all other goals and became distressed when telepathic links were disrupted or when beings acted without consulting their groups. Her greatest fear was mental isolation, and her greatest desire was perfect unity between all thinking beings. She could be influenced by threatening to cut off her telepathic connections or by offering her opportunities to achieve greater mental harmony. Ancient Beyond Name's profile showed that he valued knowledge and long-term thinking over immediate results and always chose to observe rather than act when possible. His greatest fear was making irreversible mistakes, and his greatest desire was to witness the long-term development of younger species. He could be motivated by presenting him with unique learning opportunities or by suggesting that hasty action would destroy something precious. Park studied the profiles that Hana displayed and asked how she had gathered so much detailed information in just one day of meetings. Hana explained that most beings revealed everything about themselves through micro-expressions, body language, speech patterns, and unconscious behaviors that they did not even realize they were displaying. Reading these signals was simply a matter of knowing what to look for and having enough processing power to analyze the data in real time. The equipment she had brought was not just for taking notes, but for recording and analyzing every word, gesture, and movement made by every being in the summit hall. Her tablet had been running facial recognition software that tracked pupil dilation and muscle tension. Hidden sensors had been measuring pheromone releases and electromagnetic signatures. Audio processors had been analyzing voice stress patterns and linguistic choices. Kim asked what she planned to do with all of this information, and Hana's smile was cold as winter on an ice planet. She had been running probability matrices for the past 72 hours without sleep, and she knew exactly how the war against the Vorthon Empire would unfold if the current diplomatic approach continued. The allied species would fail because they were all thinking like their species always thought instead of thinking like their enemies. The Vorthons were different from every other alien species that the galaxy had encountered because they thought like humans. They were adaptable and unpredictable and willing to use tactics that other species would consider dishonorable or illogical. The traditional alien approaches to warfare would be useless against enemies who could think outside their own cultural limitations. Hana's screens showed detailed battle simulations that demonstrated how Corvani honor charges would be defeated by Vorthon ambush tactics. Nixari telepathic coordination would fail against enemies who used communication jamming and false signals. Eldrani patience and observation would be worthless against enemies who struck quickly and moved constantly. Every traditional alien strategy had fatal weaknesses that human-trained Vorthon commanders would exploit ruthlessly. Park asked if she had solutions to these problems, and Hana's fingers began pulling up new displays that showed completely different tactical scenarios. She had been developing strategies that would turn each species' predictable behaviors into advantages instead of weaknesses. The key was making them think they were following their natural instincts while actually following patterns that she had designed for maximum effectiveness against Vorthon tactics. The Corvani could be made to charge at exactly the right times and places to create tactical advantages. The Nexari could be guided to use their telepathy in ways that would confuse enemies instead of allies. The Eldrani could be convinced that patient observation was actually a form of active warfare. Each species would do what felt natural to them, while unknowingly participating in a larger strategy that none of them fully understood. Kim asked if this meant she was planning to manipulate the other delegations, and Hana replied that manipulation was such an ugly word for what she preferred to call strategic guidance. The alien delegates would make their own choices based on their own cultural values and biological imperatives, but those choices would be influenced by carefully presented information and precisely timed suggestions. They would never realize that their independent decisions were actually following a predetermined script. The emergency alarms began screaming through Harmony's Edge at exactly 0400 hours station time, and the sound was loud enough to wake the dead. Red warning lights flashed in every corridor as automated voices announced in 12 different languages that hostile forces had been detected approaching the neutral zone. Park was the first of the humans to reach their emergency stations, and his military training had him fully alert within seconds of the first alarm. Ambassador Kim stumbled out of his sleeping quarters, still wearing his nightclothes and demanding to know what was happening. The station's communication system crackled with panicked messages from Council fleet commanders who reported that the Vorthon Empire had arrived 3 weeks ahead of their projected schedule. The enemy fleet was massive and moving fast, and it would reach the Council's defensive positions in less than 6 hours. Hana emerged from her room looking calm and composed, as if she had been expecting this exact scenario. She carried her tablet and her additional processing equipment, and she was already connecting to the station's communication networks before Kim had finished getting dressed. Park noticed that she showed no surprise at the early arrival of the Vorthons, and he wondered if her probability calculations had predicted this development. The main meeting hall was in chaos when the 3 humans arrived, and alien delegates were shouting at each other in languages that the translation systems could barely keep up with. General Thexmore was roaring orders at his Corvani warriors while Elder Vex Neal pulsed angry red light as she tried to coordinate with other Nexari commanders. Ancient Beyond Name had shifted into a form that looked like storm clouds, and his Energy patterns flickered with what might have been concern or excitement. The tactical displays showed that the Council forces were scattered across 3 different star systems because no one had expected the Vorthons to move so quickly. The Corvani battle fleets were positioned for honor duels in open space. The Nexari coordination ships were spread thin to maintain telepathic coverage across impossible distances. The Eldrani observation vessels were placed far from the action, so they could study the enemy safely. Ambassador Kim tried to get the attention of the other delegates so he could offer humanity's assistance, but his voice was completely lost in the noise of 12 different species, all trying to implement their own battle plans at the same time. The Corvani wanted to charge directly at the approaching enemy. The Nexari wanted to fall back and regroup for better telepathic coordination. The Eldrani wanted to withdraw to safer positions for long-term observation. Hana walked quietly to the communication console that controlled the station's emergency networks, and she began entering access codes that Ambassador Kim had given her for evacuation coordination purposes. The console recognized her diplomatic credentials and granted her full access to all Council military communication channels. Park watched her fingers move across the controls, and he realized that she was not preparing to coordinate any evacuation. The first Vorthan ships appeared on the tactical displays as they dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the star system. Their black hulls were covered with weapons that no Council species had seen before, and their formation patterns were unlike anything in recorded galactic military history. General Thexmore studied the enemy ships and declared that they moved, like cowards who were afraid to face honorable warriors in direct combat. Elder Vex Neal tried to establish telepathic contact with the approaching vessels, but her mental probes encountered some kind of interference that blocked all Nexari communication attempts. She announced that the Vorthons were using technology that disrupted telepathic links, and her light patterns shifted to colors that indicated deep confusion and growing fear. Ancient Beyond Name observed the enemy formations and noted that they seemed to be using tactics adapted from multiple different species. The Council fleet commanders began implementing emergency battle plans that each species had developed independently over centuries of warfare. The Corvani ships moved into attack formations that emphasized individual ship combat and personal honor. The Nexari vessels tried to create telepathic coordination networks despite the enemy interference. The Eldrani ships began retreating to observation positions that would allow them to study the battle from safety. Hana watched the fleet movements on her displays, and her fingers began entering commands that sent carefully crafted messages to specific commanders in each species' military hierarchy. She was not sending orders because she had no authority to command alien fleets, but she was providing information that would influence their tactical decisions. Each message was designed to trigger specific psychological responses based on her detailed analysis of how each species thought. The message she sent to General Thexmore included intelligence reports suggesting that the Nexari were planning to claim all the glory from the coming battle and leave the Corvani with nothing but support roles. The general's scales turned dark red with rage when he read this, and he immediately ordered his ships to advance faster so they could engage the enemy before the telepaths could steal their honor. The message she sent to Elder Vex Neal contained tactical analysis indicating that the Corvani were planning to abandon their positions and leave the Nexari ships exposed to enemy attack. Her crystalline form pulsed with alarm patterns when she processed this information, and she quickly redirected her coordination ships to defensive positions that would protect them from both the Vorthans and potential Corvani betrayal. The message she sent to Ancient Beyond Name included historical data showing that younger species often ignored the wisdom of their elders during times of crisis and made mistakes that could have been avoided with proper guidance. His energy form shifted into shapes that suggested deep contemplation as he ordered the Eldrani ships to move closer to the battle so they could provide better advice to the other Council forces. Within 2 hours, the entire Council fleet formation had changed as each species reacted to the information that Hana had provided them. The Corvani ships pushed forward aggressively to claim the best fighting positions. The Nexari vessels fell back into defensive clusters to protect themselves from enemies on multiple fronts. The Eldrani ships moved into intermediate positions, where they could observe and advise without being in immediate danger. Park watched the tactical displays and realized that the scattered council forces were now forming a pattern that looked almost like a trap, but he could not understand how. The movements of 3 different species could be coordinated without any central command structure. Ambassador Kim noticed the same thing and asked Hana what she was doing, but she only replied that she was helping each species do what they wanted to do anyway. The Vorthon fleet continued its approach, and their formation began to shift as they prepared to exploit the apparent disorganization of the Council forces. Their commanders had studied the military doctrines of every known alien species, and they recognized the classic mistakes that each race made when forced to work together. The Corvani were being aggressive and reckless as always. The Nexari were being defensive and paranoid as expected. The Eldrani were being passive and distant as predicted. Admiral Vex Carrion commanded the Vorthon fleet from his flagship, and he had trained under human strategic advisors who had taught him to think like the galaxy's most adaptable species. He could see that the Council forces were falling into the same predictable patterns that had allowed the Vorthons to conquer 3 star systems without major losses. His own ships moved into attack formations that would exploit every traditional weakness of every alien military doctrine. The Vorthans began their assault by targeting the Corvani ships with concentrated firepower that was designed to provoke them into individual combat duels that would break their formation. They attacked the Nexari coordination vessels with jamming signals that would disrupt their telepathic links and force them into isolated defensive positions. They ignored the Eldrani observation ships because passive enemies posed no immediate threat and could be dealt with after the real warriors were defeated. General Thex Moore took the bait exactly as Hana had predicted and ordered his ships to engage in individual combat with the nearest Vorthon vessels. His warriors roared their battle cries as they charged forward with weapons blazing and honor burning in their hearts. Elder Vex Nil responded to the telepathic jamming by pulling her ships into tighter defensive formations that would maintain their mental links even under electronic attack. Ancient Beyond Name ordered his vessels to move closer so they could provide tactical advice to the younger species who were clearly making mistakes. Admiral Vex Carrion watched the Council forces react exactly as his human advisors had taught him to expect, and he smiled with satisfaction as he prepared to implement the same tactics that had crushed 17 different alien coalitions. The Corvani would be destroyed through superior coordination. The Nexari would be defeated through communication disruption. The Eldrani would be ignored until they were the only ones left, and then they would surrender rather than fight. But the human advisors who had trained the Vorton commanders had never met Lee Hana, and they had never encountered a strategic mind that could think several moves ahead of everyone else in the galaxy. Admiral Vex Carrion stood on the bridge of his flagship and watched the tactical displays with the confidence of a predator who had cornered his prey. The Council forces were behaving exactly as his human strategic advisors had predicted, and within 3 hours the Vorthon Empire would claim another victory that would bring them closer to controlling the entire galaxy. His ships were moving into the final attack positions that would destroy the scattered alien fleets one species at a time. The Corvani had taken the bait perfectly, and their honor-bound warriors were charging into individual duels that isolated them from their support vessels. General Thex Moore was leading the attack personally in his massive dreadnought, and his passionate battle cries echoed across all communication frequencies as he demanded glorious combat with worthy enemies. The Vorthon commanders smiled as they prepared to grant his wish in ways that he would not survive to regret. The Nexari had reacted to the telepathic jamming exactly as expected, and their coordination ships were pulling back into defensive clusters that would protect their mental links but leave them vulnerable to concentrated firepower. Elder Vex Nil was desperately trying to maintain communications with her scattered fleet commanders, but the Vorthon interference was growing stronger as their ships moved closer to optimal attack positions. The Eldrani had responded to the crisis by moving their observation vessels into positions where they could study the battle and provide advice to the younger species, but they remained far enough from the fighting to avoid any real danger. Ancient Beyond Name was analyzing the Vorthon tactical formations and preparing to share his wisdom with allies who were too busy fighting to listen to his counsel. Admiral Vex Carrion had studied the military histories of all 3 species, and he knew that their traditional approaches to warfare had fatal weaknesses that human-trained strategists could exploit ruthlessly. The Corvani emphasis on personal honor made them predictable and easy to manipulate into tactical mistakes. The Nexari dependence on telepathic coordination made them helpless when their mental links were disrupted. The Eldrani preference for observation over action made them irrelevant until the real fighting was over. But as the Vorthon fleet moved into what should have been the perfect ambush positions, something began to go wrong with the battle plan that had worked successfully against 17 previous alien coalitions. The Corvani ships that were supposed to be charging blindly into individual duels were actually moving in patterns that created overlapping fields of fire. The Nexari vessels that were supposed to be retreating in confusion were actually establishing defensive positions that covered crucial strategic points. The first indication that the trap was not working as intended came when General Thex Moore's seemingly reckless charge led the Vorthon pursuit ships directly into a narrow asteroid field where their superior numbers became a disadvantage instead of a strength. The massive Corvani dreadnought could maneuver through the rocky obstacles with surprising grace, while the smaller Vorthon vessels found themselves constrained by the terrain and unable to bring their full firepower to bear. Admiral Vex Carrion ordered his ships to adjust their formations, but discovered that the Nexari telepathic interference was actually working in reverse and jamming Vorthon communications instead of council frequencies. Elder Vex Nil had somehow adapted her coordination networks to use the enemy's own jamming signals as carrier waves for her telepathic links, and now the council forces had better communication than the attacking fleet. The Eldrani observation, ships that were supposed to be passive and irrelevant, suddenly revealed that their positions were not random but carefully chosen to provide sensor coverage of the entire battlefield. Ancient beyond name was sharing detailed tactical intelligence with all council commanders, and his 10,000 years of military experience were proving to be more valuable than the Vorthons had anticipated. The battle that Admiral Vex Carrion had expected to win within 3 hours was turning into a nightmare scenario where every tactical advantage his fleet possessed was being neutralized by enemy responses that made no logical sense. The Council forces were fighting with coordination and strategic planning that should have been impossible given their cultural differences and traditional military doctrines. On Harmony's edge, Hana continued to monitor the battle through her connection to the Council communication networks, and her tablet displayed probability curves that showed the engagement unfolding exactly as she had calculated 73 hours earlier. Every move that the Vorthon fleet made was taking them deeper into a web of tactical disadvantages that she had designed specifically to exploit their human-trained strategies. General Thex Moore's seemingly suicidal charge through the asteroid field was actually following a precise course that Hana had mapped to minimize Corvani casualties while maximizing the terrain advantages that massive ships possessed over smaller vessels. The Corvani were fighting with the same honor and aggression that they always displayed, but they were doing it in locations and formations that turned their cultural imperatives into tactical weapons. Elder Vex Neil's adaptation to the telepathic jamming was possible because Hana had provided her with technical specifications that showed how the Vorthon interference systems worked and how they could be reversed. The Nexari were using their natural telepathic abilities in ways that felt familiar and comfortable to them, but they were actually implementing communication strategies that Hana had designed to give the Council forces information superiority over their enemies. Ancient Beyond Name's positioning of the Eldrani observation ships followed recommendations that Hana had carefully crafted to appeal to his desire for comprehensive battlefield knowledge, while secretly establishing sensor networks that would provide perfect intelligence coverage of the entire engagement. The Eldrani were satisfying their cultural need to observe and analyze, but they were doing it in ways that gave all Council forces unprecedented situational awareness. Admiral Vex Carrion realized that his fleet was not fighting 3 separate alien species who were following their predictable cultural patterns, but was instead facing a unified force that was implementing sophisticated strategies that seemed almost human in their complexity and adaptability. The Council forces were moving and fighting with coordination that suggested a single strategic mind was directing their actions from behind the scenes. The Vorthon flagship came under direct attack from Corvani heavy cruisers that had approached through an asteroid field that should have been impossible to navigate at combat speeds. Admiral Vex Carrion ordered evasive maneuvers, but discovered that Nexari coordination ships were using their telepathic abilities to predict his movements and guide enemy weapons with unprecedented accuracy. Eldrani observation vessels were providing real-time intelligence that allowed Council forces to anticipate every tactical decision his commanders made. Ambassador Kim and Park watched the battle displays in the Harmony's Edge meeting hall and realized that they were witnessing something unprecedented in galactic military history. The Council forces were not just winning the engagement, but were demonstrating tactical capabilities that no alien species had ever possessed before. The traditionally fragmented alliance was fighting with the coordination and strategic thinking of a single unified command structure. Park asked Hana how she had managed to coordinate 3 different species who barely trusted each other into implementing strategies that none of them fully understood. She explained that coordination was not the right word for what she had accomplished, because that implied direct command and control over forces that she had no authority to lead. Instead, she had provided each species with information that would guide them toward tactical decisions that served their own cultural imperatives, while also supporting her overall battle plan. The Corvani were fighting for honor and glory, but they were doing it in locations and formations that Hana had identified as optimal for their ship designs and weapon systems. The Nexari were protecting their telepathic networks and maintaining coordination, but they were doing it using communication strategies that Hana had designed to maximize their intelligence-gathering capabilities. The Eldrani were observing and analyzing the battle, but they were doing it from positions that Hana had selected to provide the best possible sensor coverage of the entire engagement. Admiral Vex Carrion sent a final desperate message to all Council frequencies as his flagship's shields failed under concentrated fire from 3 different species who were somehow working together with perfect coordination. His message asked how the Council forces had managed to achieve such tactical unity when every intelligence report indicated that they barely trusted each other enough to sit in the same room. The response came from Hana herself, and her voice was broadcast across all military communication channels in the galaxy. She told Admiral Vex Carrion that his mistake had been learning to think like humans, while forgetting what made humans truly dangerous in the first place. The Vorthons had studied human military history and tactical doctrine, but they had missed the most important lesson that any species needed to understand about humanity. The main meeting hall of Harmony's Edge was completely silent for the first time since the emergency summit had begun, and the only sounds came from the soft hum of life support systems and the distant vibrations of ships docking at the station's arms. The tactical displays showed the scattered remains of the Vorton fleet drifting in space like broken toys, and the casualty reports streaming in from Council forces indicated losses so minimal that they seemed impossible given the scale of the engagement. General Thexmore stood perfectly still next to his section of the conference table, and his massive reptilian form seemed smaller somehow as he stared at the battle statistics that showed his Corvani warriors had achieved the most glorious victory in their species' recorded history. His scales had shifted to colors that indicated deep confusion mixed with reluctant respect, as he tried to understand how a battle that had felt like pure instinctive combat had actually been part of a larger strategic plan that he had never seen. Elder Vex Nil pulsed with soft golden light that meant she was experiencing emotions too complex for simple color patterns to express, and her crystalline form reflected the tactical displays in fractured rainbows that seemed to dance with their own intelligence. Her telepathic abilities had detected something unprecedented during the battle when she realized that every decision her coordination ships had made felt natural and correct, but also served purposes that she had not initially understood. Ancient. Beyond Name had shifted into a form that resembled a vast library filled with books that wrote themselves, and his energy patterns flickered with what might have been wonder or possibly fear as he processed the implications of what he had witnessed. In 10,000 years of existence, he had never encountered a strategic mind capable of orchestrating such complex multi-species coordination without any direct command authority over the forces involved. Ambassador Kim sat in his chair with his hands folded in his lap, and his face showed the expression of a man who had discovered that someone he thought he knew was actually a complete stranger. Park stood against the wall with his hand resting on his weapon, but his military instincts were confused because he could not identify any immediate threat in the room, even though he felt surrounded by danger. Hana remained in her simple chair. Behind Ambassador Kim, and her tablet displayed post-battle analysis reports that she was organizing with the same calm efficiency she had shown while taking notes during diplomatic sessions. Her fingers moved across the screen at normal speed now, and her expression was as composed and unremarkable as it had been throughout the entire crisis. She looked exactly like what she was supposed to be, which was a diplomatic aide whose job was to handle paperwork and scheduling. The silence stretched on for several minutes as each delegate tried to process what had happened and how their individual tactical decisions had somehow combined into a perfectly coordinated military operation that had destroyed an enemy fleet without any central command structure. The mathematics alone should have made such coordination impossible, but the evidence was undeniable in the casualty reports and debris patterns that told the story of the most efficient space battle in galactic history. General Thex Moore was the first to break the silence, and his voice sounded like grinding stone as he asked Ambassador Kim how the humans had managed to achieve such tactical coordination between species that had been arguing with each other just hours before. Kim looked back at Hana and realized that he did not know how to answer, because he was still trying to understand what his diplomatic aide had actually done during the battle. Hana looked up from her tablet and explained that she had not achieved coordination in the traditional sense, because that would have required command authority that she did not possess over forces that belonged to sovereign alien governments. Instead, she had provided each species with information that guided them toward tactical decisions that satisfied their own cultural imperatives while also serving the larger strategic goals that were necessary to defeat the Vorthons. Elder Vex Neal asked how Hana had known what information to provide to each species and when to provide it to achieve such precise timing across multiple star systems. Hana's response was delivered in the same calm tone she used for everything else, as she explained that she had spent the previous 73 hours analyzing behavioral patterns and cultural psychology to create predictive models that showed how each species would react to specific types of intelligence reports. The Corvani had received information that triggered their competitive instincts and honor-based decision-making processes in ways that led them to choose aggressive actions in locations and formations that provided maximum tactical advantage. The Nexari had been given technical data that allowed them to adapt their telepathic abilities in ways that felt natural to them, but actually created communication networks that served broader strategic purposes. The Eldrani had been offered opportunities to observe and analyze that satisfied their cultural needs while positioning their ships to provide optimal sensor coverage. Ancient Beyond Name asked how Hana had been able to predict the behavior of beings with 10,000 years of experience, and Elder Vex Neal wanted to know how she had anticipated the responses of telepathic entities whose thought processes were fundamentally different from human psychology. General Thex Moore demanded to understand how she had known that warrior caste Corvani would react to specific types of challenges in ways that could be channeled into tactical advantages. Hana explained that prediction was simply a matter of understanding the underlying patterns that governed how different species thought and made decisions under pressure. Every sapient civilization developed consistent behavioral frameworks that determined how they would respond to specific types of stimuli, and these frameworks could be analyzed mathematically to create accurate forecasts of their actions in given situations. The Corvani always chose honor over safety when presented with challenges that questioned their courage, and they always selected the most aggressive available option when competing with other warriors for glory. The Nexari always prioritized mental harmony and coordination over individual advantage, and they always sought telepathic solutions to problems even when direct action might be more efficient. The Eldrani always valued knowledge and long-term thinking over immediate results, and they always chose observation over action when possible. Park asked how she had gathered enough information to create such detailed psychological profiles in just a few days of diplomatic meetings, and Hana replied that most beings revealed everything about themselves through unconscious behaviors that they did not realize they were displaying. Reading these signals was simply a matter of knowing what to observe and having sufficient analytical capability to process the data in real time. Ambassador Kim asked what she had written in her final report about the battle, and Hana showed him her tablet screen, which displayed a simple summary stating that Council forces had achieved victory through effective interspecies coordination and tactical flexibility. The report made no mention of strategic manipulation or psychological warfare, and it credited the success to the natural military capabilities of each participating species. General Thex Moore studied the report and asked why she was not claiming credit for orchestrating the victory that had saved the galaxy from Vorthon conquest. Hana replied that taking credit would have been counterproductive because it would have made the other species suspicious of human intentions and reluctant to work with humanity in future conflicts. It was much better to let each delegation believe that their own tactical brilliance had contributed to the successful outcome. The delegates began to realize that they were not just dealing with a skilled strategist, but with someone who understood the political implications of her actions well enough to hide her own contributions to ensure continued cooperation between species that had fundamental trust issues with each other. She had not only won a war, but had done it in a way that strengthened the alliance instead of creating new sources of conflict. Elder Vex Neil asked what Hana was planning to do next, and her crystalline form pulsed with colors that indicated curiosity mixed with wariness. Ancient Beyond Name shifted into a form that resembled a question mark made of starlight as he waited for her response. General Thex Moore's scales showed patterns that meant he was trying to decide whether humans were valuable allies or dangerous enemies. Hana closed her tablet and began packing her analytical equipment as she explained that she was returning to her regular duties as a diplomatic aide because the crisis was over and there were always more meetings to organize and more notes to take. She mentioned that she found the work satisfying because it provided opportunities to observe how different species interacted under various types of pressure. Ambassador Kim asked if she was proud of what she had accomplished, and Hana considered the question for a moment before replying that pride would be an inefficient emotional response that would not contribute to improved performance in future situations. She was satisfied with the outcome because it had achieved the desired strategic objectives with minimal casualties, but there were still 11 other species represented at the summit, and she had only completed detailed psychological analysis of 7 of them.